Let me share just a couple of thoughts in this 2-week conversation that I want to have starting this morning. I believe that as I study my own soul journey and as I walk with those in the life of ministry, I find that there are some familiar tracks that we travel together. And I think some of us find ourselves in a place called halfway there, where we're not at the beginning of something and we're certainly not at the finish of something, but we're in the middle, and it hasn't panned out exactly how we thought it was going to. And so there's a few different reactions that we have in halfway there. We can continue to try harder. We can try to go back to the start and try over to see if we can't do the first half again with a little bit more efficiency, with a little more effectiveness. I think sometimes we get discouraged, or maybe we get bitter and we blame on circumstances the reason that we haven't gotten from point A to point B, the start into the finish. And so what I would like to do for the next 2 weeks is talk about how do we navigate the halfway there? How do we navigate it when life is tough and challenging, the next step is bewildering, and we need to have some leadership going forward, and we aren't quite sure when God is going to show up. So we're going to talk about perseverance and the call to persevering for the next couple of weeks. I think it's kind of cool that at this time, as I was putting this message series together, that Ginger and I are reading The Hobbit to our kids before their bedtime routine. We read it a little bit aloud every single night, and it's my turn, so I picked The Hobbit. And this is the first time I've read the book, but I've seen the movies. How many of you are like me? You haven't read the book yet, but you've seen the Hobbit films. There's a couple of you out there, so you might know the trajectory of the film. But the main character is Bilbo Baggins, seen here on the screen. And he's a hobbit, which is just an unexpected, unassuming person. They call them halflings, curious creatures. They live in the Shire. He lives in a hobbit hole, and he's got a pretty good life. He eats about 6 different meals a day. His pantry is full. He's got plenty of people to share community with. And they seem to live by a mantra in the Shire: never go on adventures. So it's all cushy, it's predictable, it's forecasted. He knows it's going to happen next. And so one day he was eating 11 Z's, or I don't know exactly what time of day or what meal it was, and his life was interrupted by Gandalf the Grey, a wizard from Middle-earth in this story. And Gandalf begins to question him, begins to challenge him, begins to sow the seed of an opportunity to go on an adventure. And at first, Bilbo resists because his family doesn't do such a thing. And the next day, a group of dwarves show up at his house uninvited, and they eat all of his food, and they bombard his household. And they begin to talk about a journey, and Gandalf begins to tie the pieces together that he wants Bilbo to join in with the dwarves as they go back to the Lonely Mountain and to take their mountain back from the dragon called Smaug, who stole it years ago, and he's hoarding up their gold that they created. And so here's Bilbo. Of course, his reaction, we can anticipate it, right? He's like, no, thank you. I like life here in the Shire. But something happens to him as they begin to sing their songs of grief, of what has happened to them, their sadness of being exiles, going from place to place, and their future uncertain. Something begins to emerge deep within Bilbo that he's never experienced before: the curiosity to go on an adventure. And so he leaves all of his former ways behind. He puts all of his provisions together, and he chases them down on their way towards this adventure. And initially, he's excited to go. He's riding a pony, he's seeing some new sights, and they continue to go further and further outside the Shire. And he begins to hear language that he doesn't understand, songs that he's never heard of before. But he starts to get hungry. He starts to get uncomfortable. He starts to have some mishaps happen in his life, near misses from trolls and goblins and so on and so forth, and a peculiar character named Gollum that my kids absolutely adore, if you know what I'm talking about. And so again and again, as we go through this story, Bilbo continues to look back. He envisions, he wants to go back to his home, to his hobbit hole, to go back to where it's safe and predictable. But as he goes further and further away from home, he learns more about himself. He gets more and more courageous, and he proves to be a bit more useful than what it seemed when he began his journey. I think that some of us are like that. It's not just a literature piece. It's not just something that we read and we say, wow, that's a fascinating story. But that seems to be something that Tolkien saw in the human condition, that there's something inside of us, that things happen to us throughout our life where we want to go ahead and unplug the routine and jump into the unknown with passion and with fire and with curiosity about what might happen next. This also happens with biblical characters, where they leave their predictable life, their forecasted life behind, and they begin to go on a journey with God because God calls them out of the comfort and into the unknown. And instead of resisting God, they actually lean into God's plan. And God leads them on a journey, and they also find themselves halfway there, just like Bilbo found himself halfway there. We meet a character in Genesis chapter 12 who had one of these moments of aha and inspiration where he was excited and he was invited to go on a journey. We see in Genesis chapter 12, we meet Abraham, our character, for the first time. The Lord said to Abram, "Go from your country, your people, and your father's household to the land I will show you." So Abraham went. If there were sound effects in the scripture text, there would be a collective gasp after that line. Because people in Abraham's day didn't do things like this. It doesn't say that Abraham with all of his family, his father and his mother and all of his kids went. No, it says, so Abraham went as the Lord told him, and Lot went with him, and Abraham was 75 years old. You ever heard of somebody at the age of 75 deciding to do something new and fresh with their life? Absolutely not. They've got the retirement check coming. They got the benefits of AARP and the half-price coffee at McDonald's. They don't want to change anything. But here goes Abraham. He and his wife Sarai, his nephew Lot, all the possessions they had accumulated and the people they had acquired in Haran, and they set out to the land of Canaan, and they arrived there. Imagine being Abram. Imagine this. He receives a whisper, some sort of leading, that he's supposed to leave everything behind and go on a brand new adventure. And instead of resisting it, instead of just doing all the things that all of his contemporaries are doing, Abraham decides to go. Now, there's all these fancy stories throughout Jewish literature that tries to fill in the gaps. What caused him and convinced him to go? And they're hilarious stories. We don't know exactly all the details, but Abram leaves his household. He takes everything with him, and he goes to a place he's never been before. Now, there are some people who are avid Bible readers, and they would like to go retrace the footsteps of biblical characters. Resist the temptation to go to the early places where Abram goes, because they're the most uninteresting places you'll ever have been before. They're like flyover country where I'm from in Kansas, okay? Anywhere you look, it's just nothing but desolation. And so here's Abram. He's on a fantastic journey. He's on an adventure, and he goes to a brand new place. And at some point, he probably asked himself, why did I agree to this in the first place? But nevertheless, he went. This is what author David Brooks calls an annunciation moment. He says this in his book, The Second Mountain. The annunciation moment is when something sparks an interest or casts a spell, isn't that a lovely idea? Or arouses a desire that somehow prefigures much of what comes after in life, both the delights and challenges. When you hear adults talk about their annunciation moments, they often tell stories of something lost and something found. Abraham lost the comfort of his own home, all that he had known, the traditions of his household and his family and the wider community, and he wanted to discover something new. I think you and I have been there before. Something casts a spell over us. Something energizes us. And we start something new. Like for some of us, we were in a great job and we loved it, but at some point, a fascination began to develop in our mind that perhaps we'd like to do something else with our life. And so even though we had a pretty good job and we had a pretty good paycheck, we started scrolling on the University of Memphis looking to get maybe a different degree and to go a different direction. And so we decided to take the leap. For some of us, it was we wanted to start a family, and so even though we could go anywhere we wanted at any time, we could use our vacation as we choose. We got great sleep, and the house wasn't crowded with extra things to raise kids. We decided to take the leap, and even though the boundary and the goalpost moves again and again, and we never seem to get our arms around raising kids, even though they get older, we never know what's next. We took the leap. We decided to make a change. For some of us, we want to have a side hustle on an income, and somebody told us about an opportunity. They call it momtrepreneuring. And somebody said, I've got a great business idea. You can sell essential oils or this thing or that thing, and you can make upwards of $600 extra dollars a month. Imagine what you could do with that money. And we'll send you on cruises if you're a top seller. And so we bought into the business, and we started posting on Facebook and Instagram and Snapchat. And we talked to everyone. We've got the decals on our car because we would like to develop this new business idea that we'd come across because it lit a fire in our belly. It caused us to have a spell cast over us. Maybe for some of us, we're students, we're halfway through high school, and we loved high school initially, but man, we're like in just the dog days of high school, and we're wondering, when is the finish line? Some of us are in college, and we got all of our gen eds done, and people keep asking us, what are you going to do with your life? And you're like, I don't know. I have no idea what's next. And we're halfway there. We started something, but we don't know what's going to happen next. Our enthusiasm is perhaps waning. But initially, there was enthusiasm. Initially, there was something that was catching us up. And so what we have is an important moment where we're not at the start of something, we're not at the end of something, we're halfway there. And the question that emerges in our minds is, what are we going to do? Now, I got a drawing that I'm going to show on the screen. It's also in your bulletin. Just something for you and I to do some discernment, to do some reflection with. This is how a journey happens, an adventure. We have an idea. We have a start of something. We have a dream. But then life actually happens. You know what I found about ideas? Ideas start out as ideals. We think that once we start this business, we'll start making money in 5 months, when it's really probably 50 months, okay? Parenting is going to be like this. This new job is going to be like this. This new occupation is going to go like this. And so we've got this ideal. We've got this expectation. And so we launch out, and then we get down the road a little bit, and something wildly different happens. Something that we weren't anticipating. It wasn't a part of the package ideal that we had agreed to when we started. So we're halfway there. We have a gut check moment. Is this dream, this idea, this journey, this adventure, is it worth pursuing? Even though it hasn't panned out the way that we've expected. Is it worth going further, digging deeper, investing more, straining further in order to go forward in the next step of this journey? Or is it too much? Is the gap between what we thought was going to happen and what's actually taking place too big for us to reconcile? We want to start over, to unplug it, and to do something new. That's the question at the heart of Abraham's story as well. In Genesis chapter 15, Abraham has his moment of halfway there. This is not the Genesis 12 period of time when he's leaving home freely and going on this wild adventure and wondering what's going to be next out there and looking behind his shoulders to see if anyone's going to follow him or not. Like, he's in a different place in Genesis chapter 15. He's actually got some questions for God because he's halfway there. It hasn't panned out. He doesn't know what to do next. So in Genesis 15, verses 2 through 4 and 6, this is what Abraham says. But Abram said, "Sovereign Lord, what can you give me since I remain childless? And the one who will inherit my estate is Eliezer of Damascus." So at this point, Abraham's pushing close to 100 years old. And God said, your promise is going to be this. I'm going to give you a family that's going to turn into a nation, and that nation's going to bless all other nations. And so here's Abraham. He's like, man, I'm getting really up there. Like, I've got some relatives that lived a long time, but none of them were having kids at this age. So God, you promised this. It hasn't panned out like I expected. So it seems like by default, all that I have, the only play that I have, is allow a household servant, the one who's a scratch golfer and seems to be better than the rest, he's going to be one to take the keys of the estate. And Abraham said, you have given me no children, God. So a servant in my household will be my heir. Then the word of the Lord came to him, this man will not be your heir, but a son who is your own flesh and blood will be your heir. And notice Abraham's response. Abraham believed the Lord, and he credited to him as righteousness. So Abraham's got questions. And before any of the circumstances change, Abraham steps into a place of trust. But before we get the figment of our imagination that everything was solved at this point, we go to the very next few verses. And even though Abraham's trusting God, he's still got more questions. But Abram said, Sovereign Lord, how can I know that I will gain possession of it? So this is God's response. Not exactly what you would expect. So the Lord said to him, bring me a heifer, a goat, and a ram, and each 3 years old, not 2 or 4, but 3, along with a dove and a young pigeon. Isn't that crazy? Like, that's God's response. Abraham's got an honest question. How am I going to take possession of it? And God says, give me some animals. Well, this is really interesting. Okay. What Abraham does with them is even more interesting. In the next few verses, Abraham, okay, if you get queasy, this is earmuff time. Abraham takes those animals, he cuts them in half, he puts one half on one side of a path and one half on the other side and waits for God to do something next. He actually has to chase birds away as he makes this offering to God. Now, this is a really interesting thing, and we might, as 21st century Bible readers, say, what in the world is this guy thinking? This is some crazy activity from a biblical hero. But you know what? People years from now are going to wonder why we stared at black screens as much as we do. Can I hear an amen? So Abraham's waiting for something. And what happens next is even more peculiar. Go to the next slide. As the sun was setting, Abraham fell into a deep sleep, and a thick and dreadful darkness came over him. What's Abraham doing here? Some scholars suggest what's happening here is a familiar rite and ceremony in Abraham's time. It's called a suzerain and vassal treaty. Let me explain. Whenever two nations would war against one another, the winning side would be able to take all the spoils of the losing side. So the king of the winning side had a decision to make. Do we just go ahead and mop up the rest of the operation here and take everyone out? Or do we take this opportunity with the remaining people from this defeated army and bring them into our community as slaves who will serve us? Whenever he picks option B in this time, they do a suzerain and vassal treaty. Suzerain is the king in this scenario. The vassal is the defeated person in this scenario. This is what would happen. They would take animals like a heifer and a ram and a goat and some pigeons, okay? They would cut them in half. They would place them on both sides of a path, and the blood would run between them. Once again, queasy, earmuff time. And this is what the defeated folks would do. They understood that if they did not vow commitment to this king, they would be put to death. So the better option was to become one of their slaves. So they would walk through the divided pieces of animal, and they would make this proclamation: "You're merciful to us, King. Thank you for sparing our lives. If we go against you or are not faithful to you, may we become like the animals that we see before us." So you get the what's going on here? There's a vow to a victorious king, and the vassal walks through the pieces of animal. Now let's import that to the story, because what happens next is amazing. No, go to the next slide. Sorry, verse 17. Back one slide. Thank you. When the sun had set and darkness had fallen, a smoking fire pot with a blazing torch appeared and passed between the pieces. This is what we call in biblical language a theophany, okay? Representation of God for us who are in our finite minds are not blown away by all of God's glory. God will give us these special manifestations. So as Abraham is sleeping, as he's waiting for God to give him the next directions, it's not Abraham who walks through the pieces to make a vow to this God as the vulnerable and defeated one, but God himself walks through the pieces. What we have here is a stunning picture of God. God says, "I'm your stand-in, Abraham. You have questions about your ability and your fittedness. You've got questions about the details. You're wondering where I am and where the solution is when you're halfway there. Here's my response. If this plan goes awry, it's on me and I will fix it." God is willing to take the place of the vulnerable one in order to convince us that He has not left us. He's not forsaking us, but He will help us when we are halfway there. What a beautiful picture of Jesus, a foreshadowing of Jesus. That Jesus struggles and He suffers and He dies on a cross as a stand-in for the sins of a vulnerable humanity. God Himself provides the way for our salvation. What happens here is not just a calming of Abraham's fears, but it actually opens up a new idea of how to relate to God. In the neighboring communities around Abraham, you were always trying to wonder if you were in right standing with God. Did we offer enough animals or the right animals? But here God says, "I lower myself to be with you, and I commit to you in a covenant to always be with you. We see this in verse 18 at the end of the text. On that day, the Lord made a covenant with Abram and said, to your descendants I give this land, from the Wadi of Egypt to the great river, the Euphrates. So in the midst of the halfway there moment for Abraham, here's the message that we need to hear this morning, is that God's there with us. That even though we're wandering in bewilderment, even though it doesn't seem like the answer is quite clear, or the next step is highlighted for us, what we can have an assurance of this morning is that God is there with us, just like God was with Abraham. And what a wonderful opportunity for Abraham, not just to have his own fears consoled, but to announce to the world who God is and what he's like. He's a God who lowers himself and he suffers along with us. I see that as a part of, back to Bilbo's story, as Bilbo is going further and further away, and he's asking his own questions, and he's been taking opportunities to consider if he should go further with this group of people and to help them with their cause, or to go back home to his comfort. Again and again, he shows that he is useful, that there's more to him than he could ever have imagined, and so the journey gets brighter and brighter. He gets stronger and stronger. He becomes more useful as the time goes on. The one who was the most doubtful of Bilbo's effectiveness in the Hobbit is Thorin Oakenshield, the king of the dwarves. He belittles Bilbo again and again. He says passive-aggressive things under his breath about Bilbo's inability to do anything. But at the end of the book, and hopefully this doesn't spoil it for you, but man, it was published in the 30s. 1930, okay, so you've had your time. But as Thorin is reflecting on all of his time with Bilbo, this is what he says about Bilbo as he works through his own grief, his own sadness, his own greed and gold and silver. He says this about the Hobbit, who he had no hope in at the beginning of the journey. If more of us valued food and cheer and song above hoarded gold like you, it'd be a merrier world. So what's the potential of going further when we're halfway there? I think for us as Christians, we get to see God's provision for our lives. We get to see that he's put more in us than we've ever recognized before, and we have a chance to shape the world around us as God is faithful and as people watch God's faithfulness in our life. And so my request and my plea to you as a brother who suffers along with you halfway there, let's keep going further. And we can go further because God's there with us.